This is the video where I finally put it all together. I'm not going to give you all the research here. If it's important to you, you'll at least Google the pertinent information. If you're really interested, I have some files I'll send you, and you can read it for yourself. But this one is just too controversial to just put it all out there. In the last few months, when I started putting all this together, I really didn't see it taking me all the places it's led. Government, economics, philosophy, culture, music, art, it's all in there somewhere. Through the primary elections, and even today as I write this, as Dr. Lisa Ford and Judge Brett Kavanaugh testify before a Senate hearing committee before his confirmation as a Supreme Court Justice, and with just a few scant weeks remaining before the midterm elections, we will all see how this mess plays out as we go forward. In the last few videos, I've talked about socialism and how I believe that it is destroying our country. I am more convinced of that than ever. But I have my doubts about capitalism as well. Now don't get me wrong, I still think that a free market is the best economy in the world, but what if a free market is not really free? And what if both capitalism and socialism could somehow be turned on each other and themselves for a much more insidious, nefarious plan? For socialists, there is no greater enemy than capitalism. Socialists see the capitalists because they control the means of production, the capitalists control the means of production, as being the ones who are able to get rich. But in so doing, they use people and mistreat them. And capitalists don't like to share the wealth. Images of 1800 slavery in America and current sweatshops in Thailand and China and Indonesia are often brought to mind. And that's the reason the socialists want to take the means of production out of the hands of the individual and place them in a central authority. Whether that central authority is a government or a community, socialists believe that individuals would simply use the means of production for personal gain, which they will then hoard and exclude everyone else. So by putting the means of production in a central authority, it will be the community that decides how the profit is to be used and shared. Communal living, a community of communists. Socialists, particularly the woke self-conscious variety, are concerned about how everything turns out. They like it when everyone has a fighting chance, when it's all equal everywhere. Kind of like a game of Monopoly played in reverse. At the end, everyone should have the same amount of money, same amount of property, the same number of hotels, and so on. It's a lot more fun when the group all gets there at the same time, and the outcome is somewhat equal. That's another term they like a lot. Every life is equal. Your life, my kids' lives, my dog's life, my cat's life, the lives of the trees in my front yard. Equality is something to be grasped, and grasped tightly. It sounds great in theory, but there are two things that make me rethink all this. Greed and laziness, two basic extremes of the human condition. That's the problem with both socialism and capitalism. Neither takes into account the human condition, human nature. That leads into a religious discussion. We would have to talk about how we were created in the image of God, but we fell, and how we're born into original sin. We would have to talk about the flaw or defect or whatever you want to call it that naturally turns everything towards self, and how self rules over us from the moment we are born. Self wants what it wants when it wants it, and it wants all it can get. And it's a lifelong struggle with trying to bury self so that I can emerge and live a life of self-control. And that's a religious discussion, not a philosophical one. Philosophers may raise the questions, but I firmly believe that it is theologians that answer them. A few months ago, I was listening to Jordan Peterson talking about this thing called the Pareto Principle. The Pareto Principle is what is often called the 80-20 rule, or sometimes the 90-10 rule. It explains the reasons why the socialists can never have equality of outcome. You can have equality of input or possibilities. We can all begin at the same place, but you can never have equality of outcome, the same amount of property or the same amount of money, which is what they want, to each according to his need and from each according to his ability. But big questions come into play, such as who gets to determine what's equal? What are the defining factors? How does someone move up the scale? And is there a scale? Peterson has several videos that talk about this, and it's beyond the scope of what I want to talk about here, so I'll simply refer you to him for practical implications. But if you look at the Pareto principle, and if you look at any human endeavor, it's 20% of the people doing 80% of the work. Whether it's a church, or an office, or a construction crew, it's going to be the same. 20% of the students in a classroom will usually call out 80% of the answers when they're prompted in class. 80% of sales will come from 20% of clients. It even applies to healthcare, where 20% of patients use 80% of healthcare resources. And in any human endeavor, it will be 20% of the people holding 80% of the wealth. And that applies to socialism just as well as capitalism. It doesn't go just one way. Dr. Peterson uses the examples of books in airports and musical composers to illustrate this. If you go into an airport bookstore, you'll see the same authors over and over, Stephen King or David Balducci or whoever. It's 10 to 20% of the authors that have consistent sales over and over. The same is true of musical composers. If you listen to classical music, it's a small number of composers that have their works reproduced by philharmonics and community orchestras. It's a small number that have their works played on classical radio. And the formula holds true to individual works as well. Of all the works that Mozart or Beethoven produced, only a fraction of their work is known. Of all the books that Stephen King has ever written, only a few have been put in airport bookstores. And so it goes. The Pareto principle applies to all walks of life and pretty much yields the same results in all cases. 20% of causes yield 80% of the results. There is actually a scientific formula, and you can go online and look that up for yourself. The point that I want to make with this is that it applies to both socialism and capitalism. A second point is that it's not about greed or revolution. It's about the human condition. So what am I getting at here? I like the memes on Facebook that have Morpheus from The Matrix, the guy with the sunglasses, saying, "What if I told you?" Well, my question is, would you believe? And that's up to you. But the big reveal here is a model that has 10% of the people at the top. That's the power group. And there are 90% of the people at the bottom, which is the production group. And that's exactly what happens whether you take the means of production out of the hands of the many and you put it in the hands of a centralized authority, or if you leave it with individuals and allow them to do for themselves. Now I want you to picture a scenario. What if you were to have the group at the top, that 10%, that were capitalists, people who believed in the power of the individual? And what if the bottom 90% were a socialist group and they were committed to willingly handing everything over to the capitalist group, the ones on top? And what if the capitalist group was willingly taking it? It wouldn't really matter what the group at the top called themselves, would it? They might even call themselves socialists too, just like the people at the bottom. But that might somehow explain how people in the bottom group keep getting poorer because they're giving all their product away, and the people at the top keep getting richer because they keep taking the produced goods away from the people in the bottom group. It might also explain how certain socialist presidential candidates end up with millions of dollars in their bank account and several multi-million-dollar mansions. But I digress. Now let's go one better. What if the group at the top could somehow control the group at the bottom without the bottom group knowing it? Kind of like getting on a turnpike. The vehicles are individuals, and so they think they have the freedom to go wherever they want, but in reality the road goes somewhere, and there's a designer, and that designer determines where the exits are. Think of it like this. People expect to vote during an election, but what if the candidates, both candidates, were actually chosen in such a way that no matter who wins and who loses, they are aligned in such a way that nothing in the big scheme actually changes? There's the illusion of having the freedom to change the course of history, but in reality the choices have been designed to funnel the present even further into a predetermined future. What if there was a group that was a holding cell of sorts for possible candidates for top-level positions, presidential cabinet nominees, heads of state, so on, all of whom are highly qualified, mind you. I mean, this is not like getting elected as mayor and appointing your alcoholic brother-in-law as the head of public works, but we're talking actual experts in the field. But these are people who are not committed to a particular political party. We're talking about people who are committed to wealth and power and a much bigger picture. What if members of this group were assets in a way, and that they came to the group with a special skill set, such as media or banking or a well-connected network? And what if this group were global, able to connect all the countries, all the first world countries in any case, connect them financially, monetarily, through businesses, media, and wealth? If you think about it, it's not that far-fetched. Right here in our own country, we have the Council on Foreign Relations and the even darker Trilateral Commission. If you really want to have your eyes open, do a search on the Council on Foreign Relations and media. That's a nightmare that I can't even begin to describe. Add banks to the search equation and stand back. Look at the Fabian Society in Europe, the Rhodes Scholar Program at Oxford, the Roundtable groups, the Bilderbergs, and there's a host of others. And we're not even talking about the conspiracy theory groups such as the Illuminati or the Knights Templar, and so on. And by the way, look up who the members of these groups are as well. Most of them have open membership rosters that you can locate online. Like I said at the beginning, I'm not going to put it all out there for you this time. But just start with the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, for this country at least, and you'll have enough fun for a day, or a summer. Anyway, it's probably best to drop this line of thinking. I mean, if there really were an elite group controlling the world's interests, its economies, its education, its intellect, its banks, well, that would make the rest of us liberals, conservatives, Democrats and Republicans alike, that would make all of us tools, wouldn't it? Useful idiots. I'm Ralph Williams, and that's the view from my front porch.